So tonight, the topic that I was asked to speak on is what does the Bible, what does archaeology say about the biblical record? Archaeology really wasn't started until the mid 1800s. So before that, you didn't know a lot. You didn't have good answers to some of the questions people have. So I'm going to go through those in a bit, but here's what I'm going to cover. You may have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, probably the most important archaeological find of the 1900s. Ebla tablets. Anybody heard of the Ebla tablets found in Northern Syria? That's also, I consider that one of maybe the second most important archaeological find of the last century, because they answer questions that the skeptics had. So these are the things I'm going to run through. And here's some questions that people have, in the early 1900s, the Bible is just a book of myths. How do you know it's true? Genesis and the first chapters 1 and 2, they seem to contradict each other. How can that be? Isaiah, the book of Isaiah was written after the prophecies were fulfilled. So of course the prophecies were, fulfilled. They said Sodom and Gomorrah never existed. Moses could not have written the 5 books of the Bible. I mean, people couldn't write in those days, so how could he have done that? Science in the Bible is just a fallacy. And then there's just no evidence in the Bible, just faith. So as I go through some of these archaeological finds, we're going to answer some of these questions for you. What is archaeology? I think most of you know what that is. It's a study of human cultures for the recovery, documentation, and analysis of material remains and environmental data. It explains the origins and development of human cultures, discovered a lot of ancient monuments, systematic study of the past through its physical remains, began seriously in the early to mid 1800s. Here you see a dig being done in Rome, obviously a very important part of the biblical record as well. And another one here in Alexandria, Egypt, there's a Roman theater that was unearthed later on. And you've all heard of the Stonehenge in the UK. So why do we do archaeology? Well, because you'll see as we go through that it confirms the historical accuracy of the Bible. Some ancient sites that are found, the archaeologists and the people that study this look to see, does that agree with the Bible? And as you'll see, archaeologists, whether they're believers or not, they use the Bible to start their search because they got to know where to dig, and the Bible tells you where to dig. So it illustrates and explains biblical passages better than we could without that. There are thousands of archives discovered. Many archaeological sites have yet to be excavated. They're known about, but they're not excavated to get the truth. So here's the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are scrolls found in the caves above the Dead Sea. That's why it's called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there are caves there. And on one occasion, 2 occasions actually, I've been in Israel on some actually mostly business trips, but I went by these caves and you can see the holes in the rock, and they're about 100 feet up or so. So it's no wonder that they weren't discovered till just recently. Turns out that a little shepherd boy threw a stone because he's looking for his lost sheep, and then his stones seemed to have hit something. He heard a noise. He investigated, and that's where he found the first scroll. And so after that, professionals came in and uncovered the rest of it. So it's a well-known find at this point, and it happened, 1947, 48, which happens to be the years we immigrated. But I never knew anything about them at that time. And where's the Dead Sea Scrolls? Or where's the Dead Sea? Well, you can see it here in the middle of Israel there, in the north-south. And you can see, if you've gone to Salt Lake City, you can float on the lake there. Well, you can do that here as well. The salt is actually thicker than. And then you can see the caves up there that they found. And so here's another picture of those scrolls. What did they find eventually? More than 40,000 scroll fragments found in the jars. So they were stored in jars. And you might wonder, how could they survive this long? Well, it's a very dry environment. So and obviously it didn't rain in the caves. So it was the proper environment to preserve those scrolls. So all of these were found, more than 40,000 of them. And they were all, turns out, most of them were written before the time of Christ, most copied from a previous scroll, obviously. And so most of them dated from 135 BC to 67 AD. And it contains samples and complete scrolls of all the books of the Old Testament so far, except for the book of Esther. They haven't found that yet. They found, I think they found more than 2 books of Isaiah, the complete scroll of Isaiah. There's another very significant find. So the scroll of the Isaiah dated to about 125 BC. Okay, so then the question is, did that foretell the coming Messiah, that Jesus would come? And does that match the book of Isaiah that we have today? And it turns out, yes, maybe about 1% difference, in the words and how they're written. But most of the differences were due to the changes in the Hebrew language during that period of time. There were a few dots that were misplaced and T's and not crossed, but there was nothing would change in any of our Christian doctrines at all. And in fact, that helped to confirm the truth of the book of Isaiah. And the prophecies were told before the time of Christ. So that answers one of the big questions that skeptics had. And you have no New Testament books at that time. Temple scroll, 27 feet long. You just imagine trying to unravel that, without breaking some. That's a very delicate job. So the results of this find, extant copies of the books that are more than 1,000 years older than the copies that we had before then, like the book of Isaiah. The earliest copy we had was, I think, about 1100 AD, the book of Isaiah. So now we have one before the time of Christ. So obviously theologians can compare those, and the more copies they have, the better it is, because they need to be. If they're not the same, then you wonder why. But they were the same, with a few minor things that don't change any doctrinal truth. So it increased our knowledge of what happened to the Hebrew text in its period of time. Hebrew text undergone much less change actually than previously thought. If you look at the history of the English language, you'll know that there are a lot of changes even in 400 or 500 years. And of course, the people that went to America, they changed some words. America had to be different from England, of course, so words changed. So the Hebrew text didn't change much at all. Okay, so a lot of knowledge there. Then there were more findings, very important findings over the years, the next 50 years. Some of it served to consolidate ancient chronology, findings of texts bearing on the history of writing, ancient texts that shed light on biblical history, and a lot of ancient biblical manuscripts. And then in 1974, the discovery of the Ebla tablets was found. They were found in Northern Syria. And that was also a very, very significant find, and I'll tell you why in a bit here. And of course, in the Holy Land, many excavations have been done, because that obviously is the biblical country. So the discoveries also have a bearing on the New Testament, not just the Old Testament, because a lot of things happened at the time of Christ and after the time of Christ. So those, a lot of things were found there as well. We believe that the scriptures, we take the scriptures as accurate, historically, geographically, and even scientifically. If you look at some science statements in the book, the Bible is not a science textbook, but when it makes a statement, we expect it to be true. And I have a complete lecture on that as well, comparing biblical statements with what we know about science today. So this can be verified a number of different means. History, of course, we have historical writings, we have geography, we know where places are named in old manuscripts, and we know the names of those places today, so comparison there, and archaeology and science. We also have extra biblical writing by believers and also by some non-believers alike that have verified the accuracy of the Holy Scriptures. And so archaeologists has verified the accuracy of the transmission of the Holy Bible over the centuries. And I'll show you one slide that shows that in more detail. So the transmission of the Holy Bible, the books, the originals, of course, were lost or destroyed. And we only have copies, extant copies of the books that exist today. How do we know that the copies mirror the originals? Well, textual criticism. You can compare them, the text in all these copies of these books of the Bible in the ancient manuscripts. Do they agree with what we have today, or do what we have today agree with those? So there are two major steps involved. All existing copies are analyzed, compared with each other for contextual consistency, and the time between the compilation of the original and the extant copy that we have is considered. In other words, if we have a copy of the book of one of the books of the Bible that is close to the time it was written, you have more faith in that than it was written thousands of years later. So we'll get into that. So there's no other literary work in history that compares with the Bible in that. We have a segment of the Gospel of John that goes back to 125 AD, just a small fraction, but it's word for word the same as what we have today. So how do we test the document's validity? Well, first of all, there's the internal evidence. What does the document say about itself? And of course, we also look at what did Jesus say about the books of the Bible? What did the apostles say about the books of the Bible? Then we have biographic evidence from the original documents to the copies we have today. There's a process where you can compare those. And then we have external evidence. In other words, through historical facts that we know to be true from other writings, and through archaeology, which finds new facts, and we can compare that with the Bible. So first of all, internal evidence. Well, throughout the Old Testament, there are about, I think the number close to 2,000 sayings like, "Thus saith the Lord," or "The Lord says this," and "God spoke this." Statements like that, they are all throughout the Old Testament books. So we believe those, and we have no reason not to believe those. And then the New Testament, there we have Jesus' words, which were recorded. They are considered God's words as well. And in fact, they fulfilled the prophecy of the Messiah coming. So it's consistent with the Old Testament. So in biographical evidence, there are two important questions. How many manuscript copies do we have? If we just have one or two or three or four, well, that's kind of limited. But if we have hundreds or thousands, then there's a lot of comparisons we can do. And then the second factor is how close to the time of the original do we, the copies that we have. So in the case of the New Testament, there are more than 25,000. We have 56 Greek manuscripts of books of the New Testament, 10,000 manuscripts translated into Latin, and then 9,200 other translations. So here you look at the reliability. Plato is said to have written a book back in 427 BC. And the earliest copy we had of that was 900 AD. And you got about 1,300 years from the time when it was written to the earliest copy. That's a long time. Does anybody question the validity of the books that Plato wrote? No, people don't question that, but there's only 7 copies. Okay, but then you go down to the New Testament, and we have at this point more than 25,000 copies manuscripts of the different, the 27 books of the New Testament, 24,000. So the earliest segment that I know about is from the Gospel of John, which was said to be one of the last books written in the New Testament, written about, let's say, 90 AD. Well, we have a segment, I believe it was found in Egypt, that was dated to be from 125 AD. That's only 30, 40 years difference in time. And the segment that we did find that was found is identical to the book of John today. So with that many copies, there should be no question if they agree with each other, and they do, except for some changes in language. So then external evidence, and I show you these three extra biblical findings: the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Ebla tablets, and what various historians have written. You've heard of Josephus, of course, the well-known Jewish historian. And then we'll look at the archaeology of the Old Testament events and places and people, and also the New Testament. So Ebla tablets, where were they found? Northern Syria. I think it started about 1964, but it really started in Syria in 1974. So they started digging there. This is, I'll show you a picture of it. But it turns out that Ebla was a center of a huge civilization at the time. And at the height of its power is said to be with population up to 260,000 people and a lot of civil servants. The names, and this is where it gets important, names of 5,000 cities are documented in those tablets. Notice that these are tablets. Writing was done on tablets at this time frame, not on manuscripts. So that was a change over the years. But 5,000 different cities and places are mentioned. And it turns out that much of that was destroyed in 2250 BC. And that's why, probably because people didn't find these tablets before. So again, where's Ebla? Well, you can see the Ebla is in the north western part of the Syria there, above Damascus. And so that's where these were found. You can see some pictures of the ruins here, and you can see an example of the clay tablet at Ebla there as well. So why are they important? Well, 17,000 tablets unearthed from this kingdom since 1974. Early critics did not think that writing was prevalent at the time of Moses. They questioned, Moses couldn't have written the first 5 books of the Bible. Well, here we have 1,000 years before the time of Moses. So obviously Moses could write. Remember in Acts, we read that Moses was trained in the courts of the pharaohs. So obviously he was very educated and he could read. Recent digs in Northern Syria, Ebla in mid-1970s, have verified that man had writing skills early on, even at the time of the patriarchs and before. So there's no question that Moses could write. Most writing was in the Sumerian language in these tablets, some in Ebla, with their own Semitic language using the same kind of script. So again, they had to learn how to decipher the language in the first place to see what they have. But it obviously shows evidence of writing by Moses. The customs and events were recorded in writing in the same area of the world where Moses and the patriarchs lived. And you remember, go to Genesis 14, it mentions the 5 cities of the plains. And skeptics said, Sodom and Gomorrah, they never existed. We can't find any ruins of them. Well, here, they're mentioned in the Ebla tablets, so we know they existed. Okay, so all 5 of them are referenced. So the area flourished before the catastrophe recorded in Genesis 14. We now know about early writing systems such as Egyptian hieroglyphics and other scripts. And then you come to the Hittite people. Again, people, you see the Hittites are mentioned in many of the early books of the Bible, but skeptics said they never existed. And we didn't have any records of them at the time they said that. But since then, we have found a lot over the last 150 years. So we have a better understanding of ancient chronology, and the Sumerian king list, another list. Dates of the earliest historical dynasties in Egypt and Mesopotamia have been reduced over the years from the 7th millennium BC to 300 BC. So then we come, and this is not necessarily archaeology, but this is part of the course I've done on apologetics, and I just mention them because many people don't know about the division in Genesis. Moses didn't live during the time of Genesis, so how did he get his records? So, well, in Genesis, there are statements like this. These are the generations of. So there are different original authors of the different period of time. And so Genesis 2:4, it says, this is the account of heavens and the earth when they were created. Well, that's God's account and that was given to him when Moses wrote it through the Holy Spirit. And then Genesis 5:1 said, this is the book of the generations of Adam. So, of course, Adam was there at that time, so this is the generations of Adam. And then we have the records of Noah. We have the records of the 3 sons of Noah. These are the records of the generations. And these are the records of Terah. Gets to Abraham. These are the records of Ishmael. These are the records of Isaac. So the original writers of Genesis, yes, obviously Moses didn't live during all that time, but there were records apparently that he put together. And we do know now that Moses was able to write. So archaeology has shown the truth of Genesis in many different occasions. The Genesis quotes in New Testament are not attributed to Moses by Christ in his sayings in the New Testament, but Jesus regards Moses as the author of the Pentateuch. Jesus accepted the Genesis record. Remember, people said Genesis 1 and 2 are different. No, Genesis 1 is a day-by-day record of God's creation, and Genesis 2 just talks about man. Some issues there. It's not a different history. So Genesis is a collection of generations of the ancient patriarchs. Now, there's a bunch of things I just want to mention briefly, because there are other civilizations that existed. They had different beliefs about their origins. I said before, Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, the courts of the pharaohs, Acts 7:22. So the Egyptians, believed that there was an ocean first, and then there was an egg, flower, 4 children. And you may have seen some of these names mentioned before, but this is all a myth. Okay, did Moses include any of this in the Old Testament? No, none of it. None of it is there. So Egyptian beliefs, even though he was trained in that, none of this mythical history finds its way into the Old Testament. And the same thing with the Greek beliefs. You might remember from school that, the Greek philosophers thought everything could be explained in terms of air, water, earth, and fire. 4 things that explains everything. Did that get into the Old Testament, into Genesis? No, that didn't get there. But let me go through a few more here. Okay, and then some other beliefs. Aristotle was a philosopher and a scientist, father of science, but he came up with some very strange thoughts here, like function of brain was to cool the blood. Oh, I'll skip over this one. But these philosophers had some strange thinking. but none of that is in the Bible. And, this is all, of course, before we had microscopes and telescopes, or we know a lot more through our observations today. So you've heard about the Atlas, up the hell of the wide heavens with tireless heads and arms, that we still call a book of maps and atlas, but that word doesn't appear in the Bible. Hindu beliefs, stranger yet. So, I mean, many of those ancient cultures thought that the earth was resting on the back of a turtle or on the back of an elephant or some other, strange animal. So, but we know that's not true. So, but none of that found its way into the Bible. And it's interesting to note, although I don't have it in this lecture, but what does the first verse in the Bible say? And when I do a lecture on science, I like to use this because they're let's see, Herbert was a colleague of Darwin, 1903. He came up with a scientific statement, says which everything could be explained in terms of 5 things: matter, space, action, verb, and time. 5 things. What does the first verse of the Bible say? In the beginning, that's time. God, that's force. Created, that's action. The heavens, that's space. And the earth. That's a true scientific statement. How did Moses know how to write that? Okay. Obviously by inspiration. So now we come later in the 1600s, and remember Ptolemy thought, the earth was the center of the solar system. And most scientists believe that for, I think it was about 1400 years, they thought that the earth was the center of the solar system. But now we know that no, solar system, the sun is at the center, and the planets are orbiting around the sun. And so here, Copernicus is one of the first ones that stated that. So the astronomers, so we're coming up with the heliocentric, the solar, the solar, the sun in the middle. So Moses wrote Genesis, and he was a contemporary of the Egyptians. He included none of that mythology, and also he had no telescope or microscope. So how did he come up with some of the scientific statements that we see in the first 5 books of the Bible? When I talk on that topic, I like to use the example of circumcision. When should a male child be circumcised? What day? Day 8. Why 8? Why didn't you say 6? Why didn't you say 10? And today we know from medicine that the baby's immune system is at its peak, and the blood clotting element is at its peak. How did Moses know that? He didn't. And there are a number of science statements in the Bible just like that. And you wonder, how did they come up with that? So these are the words of Moses in the first chapters here. Bible contains no absurd statements or ridiculous stories. And Genesis agrees exactly with findings of scientists and archaeologists. Okay, first 11 chapters, and of course in the creation movement, we take the first 11 chapters very literally, because it speaks that way. But there are some places where obviously it's not literal, but in the first 11 chapters, that's true history. Okay, so let's see. Similarities and differences in the creation accounts with the Genesis account. Well, there were some other accounts from other pagan accounts. One big difference is in the Genesis account, sun, moon, stars were created by God in the first part of chapter 1. In the other account, the pagan accounts, it seems they already existed. They have no idea about how that came to be. So, okay. So archaeology and the flood. Okay, the Bible speaks of a global flood from Genesis 6 to chapter 9 of Genesis. There are flood stories throughout the world, and they seem to bear some resemblance to the flood recorded in the book of Genesis. Some people would say, well, Moses copied from all these other, but no, the record in the book of Genesis is exactly how it was. And in fact, it even gives the dimensions of the ark. Some of you may have been to the Ark Encounter to see that's a full life, full length, according to what Genesis says. But all of these other accounts of a flood-like event don't have that information. Some of them have a round tub. Well, that's not going to go very far in an ocean, and that's violently changing. List of the Sumerian kings treats flood as a real event, and but there's some strange things in there too. But all flood stories have a common origin. Survivors spread over the earth. The tale of the flood went with them. Superficial similarities between the tales, and they point to historical core set of events. There's books written on the similarity of all these different accounts, all these countries, all these cultures. They all have some kind of a flood story, but they all have some common elements, and they all go back to the time after God spread the people out across the world to speaking different languages. So they had some common beliefs, but they got changed over time. So the basic floods are the same. Noah's in the Bible, and these other accounts have different names, and they have some similarities that like man is told to build a ship to certain dimensions, and the dimensions that is ideal. The length of the boat is to be 6 times the width, and that's the only way that a boat could survive in turbulent oceans. We know that today from experience. So there are differences and similarities. Okay, so there was a picture of the Ark Encounter. Let's see. Yeah, I don't want to go into all of these things here. I want to get back to the archaeology of the origin of languages. Come from the Tower of Babel, and see the evolutionist European historians, they believed that languages evolved from some animal growls and grunts, but we know that doesn't work. Believers in the Bible believe that languages originated in an area of Asia near where the Ark of Noah would have landed. Early modern investigators had said that European languages developed in Europe. Well, but then later, in 1990, an article appeared in Scientific American, which concluded that European languages actually had their start in a general area of Asia near where the Ark of Noah. So eventually they get, to what the Bible has to say there. Okay. Okay, so now let's look at some specific archaeological digs in the Old Testament. And I'm just going to go through a few. There are books written on this. I notice you have a few books in the book table there too. And I've got a few, but there's a lot more that we can cover in this time. So again, the skeptics said, well, the Hittites never existed, but it's mentioned in all these books of the Bible. So it must be true. And so skeptics were finally proven to be wrong, because with digs later on, they came to some references to Hittites in the Ebla tablets. For one, they had references to Hittites and Sodom and Gomorrah. And so now we know a lot more about the Hittites who lived in the modern day Turkey area and around there, where you can see. So what people didn't, what made this story harder to find was the fact that the Hittite emperor actually collapsed around 1200 BC. So there was no record after that. And that's one of the reasons why skeptics said they never existed. So A quote from Dr. Wright in archaeology said, "Now the Bible picture of the people fits in perfectly with what we know of the Hittite nation from the monuments. As an empire, they never conquered the land of Canaan itself, although the Hittite local tribes did settle there at an early date. Nothing discovered by the excavators has in any way discredited the biblical account. Scripture accuracy has once more been proved by the archaeologists." Sodom and Gomorrah. It has been located. Now, I think there's still some question about there are two different areas that they might have been, but nevertheless, they do agree that Sodom and Gomorrah did exist biblical times. Christ refers to that as well in the New Testament. So it's more than a legend. It was real. Okay, evidence of destruction. Here are some examples. I mean, there's, if you read the record in Genesis, there seems to be fire on the roof. And now we have seen places where there are remnants of bitumen, deposits of bitumen, etc., that could have come from some of those events described in Genesis. And there's talk of an earthquake as well. And notice in Genesis 19:28, behold the smoke of the land which went up like the smoke of a furnace. Then there's a lot of controversy about the walls of the city of Jericho. The Bible says that they fell outward. And so some archaeologists started to look into this in 1900s. Note that the houses were built against the mud brick city wall. You can see that on the side of the wall there. And this is as described in the Old Testament and rests on top of the stone retaining wall. Joshua 2:15 says that Rahab's house was built against the city wall. So it's a wall like this here. There's a large pile of bricks found at these base at the inner and outer walls, indicating sudden collapse of fortifications. Thick layer of soot indicate the city was destroyed by fire. And so we see some evidence in the digs there as well. Joshua 6:20 says, so the people shouted when the priest blew the trumpets, and it happened when the people heard the sound of the trumpet. And the people shouted with a great shout that the wall fell down flat. Then the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. So that's the record in the book of Joshua. Here's another archaeologist. He excavated Jericho in the 1930s, found the walls of Jericho as they had fallen in Joshua's time. They fell outward. Then came another archaeologist, a non-believer, Kenyan, from Britain, and she declared that the walls of Jericho did not fall down because she dated the destruction of the city 150 years before Joshua could have arrived. So how did that come about? Well, she dated it based on some pottery that she found. So her date was based on the destruction of Jericho on pottery fragments. Dr. Bryant Wood, who is well known in archaeology, showed that the destruction of Jericho did in fact happen the way the Bible said. He said a Kenyan misdated Jericho because she failed to find a certain type of pot that she was expecting. So bushels of grain were found at the site, consistent with what's it in Joshua. The walls did fall outward, and a piece of charcoal dated to be 1400 BC, which is the time of this event. Okay, Temple Mount. There's a lot of digs that have gone on, and and there's a lot of digs still going on there. People want to know, how all these temples fit together. So I won't go into it any deeper for now. But another thing a skeptic says that Belshazzar in Daniel 5. The king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. But Belshazzar was mentioned as a ruler in these 4 verses of Daniel 5. Historians 70 years later never mentioned him, Belshazzar, at all. So as if he didn't exist. Other rulers of the time were mentioned. At one time, historians scoffed at the Bible for listing Belshazzar as the last king of Babylon, because there was no record they could find of that, other than his name in the Bible. So who was Belshazzar? Well, scholars said that Nabonidus was the last king. So Belshazzar couldn't have been the last king. In the mid-1800s, archaeologists unearthed tablets in Babylon ruins that listed Belshazzar, the son of Nabonidus, as a co-ruler in Babylon. So there are 2 co-rulers at Daniel's time there. So Nabonidus, who ruled the empire of Babylon, mentions his firstborn son Belshazzar as on an inscription that was found in the city of Ur in 1853. So, and that's what it says on there. May it be that I, Nabonidus, king of Babylon, never fail you, and may my firstborn Belshazzar worship you with all of his heart. So Belshazzar was the second in command. So when Daniel was promised a position as the 3rd highest ruler, now you can see that the archaeology confirmed what is said in the Bible. Otherwise, there's no record of Belshazzar, so it just, why wasn't he named the 2nd? Well, that's why. So other findings. Okay, I'm going to go through it because I've got a lot of them here, and I don't want to leave some time for a Q&A as well. But all of these, the kings that are listed here, places that are mentioned, there was never any other evidence other than the Bible for a long time. But now the archaeology has found remnants that show that these places did exist and that these people, these kings, did exist. King Sennacherib records his victory over King Hezekiah, making him a prisoner. He does not record his failure to conquer Jerusalem and his retreat because the 185,000 of his soldiers were killed in 2 Kings 18. Why is that? Well, people don't write about the wars they lost. They only write about what they won. So the assassination of Sennacherib by his own 2 sons, recorded in 2 Kings 1937. Babylonian records mention only 1 son. So the Bible records confirmed to be true, recent by discover the annals of his son. And so again, that is an archaeological find that confirms what the Bible says. Fall of Nineveh and of Jerusalem, that's mentioned, and these tablets were found later on that mention those events as well. So again, it confirms what's in the Bible is true. Let's see, other cities, Saul's fortress at Gibeah, more Old Testament archaeology finds a pool of Samaria in 1 Kings 22. Been found Ahab's house of ivory. The water tunnel beneath Jerusalem dug by King Hezekiah to provide water during the Assyrian siege, as recorded in these places, has been found. The pools of Heshbon. Okay, so anyway, there's a lot more mentioned in those books that you have access to as well. I just mentioned a few. Archaeology of the New Testament, what do we have there? We're just going to look at a few of those here. First of all, the New Testament census, the historical accuracy. Luke, as you know, wrote the Gospel according to Luke and also the book of Acts. And at the beginning, he tells you that he did not know Jesus personally, but he had access to the eyewitnesses of Jesus' time. And so he put all that together and recorded that in those 2 books. In Luke 2, 1-5, came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. Herod's census is to be distinguished from that of the 6 AD when Quirinius was in charge of the census. The problem is Quirinius is mentioned in 2 different places, but it's there is an explanation of that. So the fragment of stone discovered at Tivoli near Rome, 1764 AD, contains an inscription in honor of a Roman official who was twice governor of Syria. So that explains why the name Quirinius is named twice, but skeptics wouldn't believe that. Luke's writings. Luke is regarded as probably the most accurate historian of the New Testament times. He mentions a lot of countries and places, and he also has mentioned some names of officials, of governors here, like proconsul, tetrarch. Those are names that were not known in the secular literature. So now, they've found examples where that archaeological finds have found those names, those titles are in fact true. So we have these other secular historians as well, right about this time period. Luke's he names key historical government figures in the correct time sequence and gives them the correct titles for their areas, although it didn't seem like it could be correct, but now we know it was correct. Sherwin-Wright writes, in all, Luke names 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands, and they're all without error. They've all been confirmed to be where Luke says they are. So for Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. John's Gospel. Some people would have said that it's thought to have been written about 400 AD by somebody not by the name of John, but posing as John. Well, now we have that one segment of the Gospel of John that was found in Egypt that is exactly like the book of the Gospel that we have today. That's what these fragments found in Egypt, dated at about 90 AD, which is when John supposedly wrote those. New Testament cites the existence of Jesus as recorded by Josephus, who is well known, and some other historians of that time, Jewish, Greek, and others. The foundation of the synagogue at Capernaum, where Jesus cured a man with an unclean spirit, as recorded in first chapter of Mark, and the site of the crucifixion. I'm not quite sure how accurate that is, but it's presumably somebody found what the place where they think he was crucified. Forcing Jews to leave Rome during the reign of Claudius, that is recorded in Acts. And other New Testament sites. Some of these you may have seen in Greece and Italy. Jacob's Well, where Jesus spoke to the Samaritan woman, the court where Jesus was tried, the marketplace of Athens and the Areopagus, chapter 17 of the Acts, the Roman theater at Ephesus has been discovered as well, and Herod's palace in Caesarea, where Paul was kept under guard, and that's a huge palace there. Okay, I'm going to skip over this one. This is some people's mind. This is questionable, but there's a researcher who says the Bible says exactly where Paul was shipwrecked, and he wanted because it names a certain aspect of that site, and some others that supposed it to be at a different site. And many people believe that this is the accurate site because there are references to the anchors there. The 4 anchors are dropped from the stern, and the depth of the water, the days at sea, and all these seem to match a certain place in in the island of Malta. So again, I'm not saying, not sure that this is all true, but this is said to be found by some explorers. Okay, so in summary then, archaeology of the Bible, many figures, biblical figures and man-made structures have been verified by archaeology. Archaeology verifies the Holy Scripture. As I said before, archaeologists now use Holy Scripture as a guide, whether they're a believer or not. They won't admit that they believe all these things, but they use the Bible as a guide anyway to do their searching because they have nothing else to go on. So archaeology confirms the Bible. Nothing has been found to disprove historical accuracy of biblical events, places, or people. Here are a few archaeologists, the statements they make. It has been stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. That's Luke, a Jewish archaeologist, and Albright, another archaeologist. Discovery after discovery has established the accuracy of innumerable details of the Bible. And Albright, regarded to be one of the great archaeologists. Luke, here's his full statement. As a matter of fact, however, it may be stated clearly, categorically, that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a single biblical reference. Scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline or exact detail historical statements in the Bible. So the Bible, book of special revelation, but general revelation agrees with the book of special revelation, the scripture. 50 or 40 authors written in 3 different languages, 39 Old Testament books, 27 new, written over 1,600 years, unchanged for 2,000 years, accurate in all historic, geographical, scientific details, one unified story of creation and a plan of redemption. All tell the same story. How would you get that to happen today? 2 people go to see an accident, they have very different remembrances of that. But here, over 1,600 years, the same story by different authors. So the Bible is unique among all religious books in scientific accuracy. Other ancient religious books abound in obvious scientific errors. I mentioned some of the Hindu, Greek, Muslim, Babylonian, Mormon sacred books. If you ask a Mormon, for example, where's the archaeology that proves the Hill of Qumran, the Golden Plates? Where are all these places that you mentioned? There is no archaeology of that. But the Bible has the answers. The Bible is in accord with modern history, geography, archaeology, and science. No superstitions. You don't find astrology or alchemy in the writings of the Bible. No other ancient book has this accuracy. No other ancient religious book could withstand this scrutiny. And I just came across a book. Somebody I borrowed from somebody. Here's a picture in the back of the book. Looks at all the archaeological digs that are going on in Jerusalem. And I noticed it shows here like the city of David, David's palace, and you can see the 3 of them there. And I had a skeptic friend, actually an atheist. He said there's no mention, there's no record of the city of David at all. And this was probably about 20 years ago we had that discussion, but now I see that there's excavations going on there that they found the temple and the city, all these places. So there's a very interesting picture there. Okay, well, with that, I'm going to bring my